Somewhere between the first satellite launch and the first Coca-Cola shipment to Moscow, humanity woke up to a chilling thought. What if tomorrow doesn't come? The Cold War was an era where no one fired directly, but everyone had their finger on the trigger. The enemy was everywhere, in textbooks, in the skies, on television, in your fridge, and most dangerously, in your imagination. The USSR and the USA, two giants who weren't fighting over land or oil. They were fighting over the right to define the future. One side offered a world of red banners, collective farms, and revolutionary optimism. The other promised Hollywood, hamburgers, and a gnawing fear of being accused of Marxist sympathies. You could be a school teacher in Ohio and lose your job because your sister once read the Communist Manifesto. You could be an actor in Los Angeles and get blacklisted for not saying, "God bless America," with enough enthusiasm. You could be the president, knowing every word you utter is dissected by some aging Politburo member in Moscow who's convinced you're the Antichrist in a Brooks Brothers suit. This was a world where everything was political. Music, movies, breakfast cereal, space missions, even football scores. Baseball became a proxy war. So did ballet. College students quoted Che Guevara, and the CIA quoted them in intelligence reports. But behind the absurdity was real danger. 70,000 nuclear warheads, submarines prowling beneath the Arctic, missiles hidden in Montana and Siberia, all waiting for a single word. And the terrifying part? That word might come not from war, but from a glitch, a radar error, a mistranslation, a tired man with the wrong instincts. It all felt insane, and yet disturbingly normal. The arms race was embedded in school curricula, national budgets, and daily life. Children learned to duck under desks in case of a nuclear flash. Adults learned to suppress emotion lest it be mistaken for weakness. The USSR, the same nation that gave the world Yuri Gagarin and Prokofiev, became, in the American psyche, the archetype of evil, cold, silent, and vaguely threatening. Meanwhile, the United States, with its jeans, Elvis, and Woodstock, was cast by Soviet propaganda as a symbol of decadence and soulless capitalism. But neither side was innocent. America supported brutal dictators as long as they were anti-communist. The USSR funded guerrilla movements as long as they promised nationalization. Both sides played dirty because both believed history was on their side. The Cold War is a story without clear fronts, but with every other form of warfare: spies, proxy conflicts, economic colonization, disinformation, and above all, a battle for imagination, for what kind of world people wanted to live in, one with freedom of choice or freedom from choice. If you enjoy deep, layered stories that unravel slowly and dramatically, subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. We love seeing how far our stories travel. On May 8, 1945, Europe celebrated victory. On September 2nd, Japan surrendered. For the first time in 6 years, the world stopped counting bodies. But those who expected to finally live like human beings quickly realized peace had not arrived. It simply hadn't had the time. Because at the very moment soldiers were returning home, A new front was already forming, silently, in offices, in glances, in rewritten maps. Germany became the first battlefield of the new order. After Hitler's fall, the country was carved into 4 occupation zones by the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France. But unity didn't last long. The Allies had shared a hatred of Nazism, not a vision of the future. The Americans brought in schools, dollars, and chewing gum. The Soviets dismantled factories and built a mirror-image mini-USSR in their zone. It was the same rubble, but 2 very different rebuilds. Berlin, divided but not yet walled, became the first scar of the Cold War. In 1947, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, a massive aid program that poured over $13 billion into rebuilding Western Europe. But it wasn't just generosity, it was strategy. Every country that accepted this aid also accepted America's orbit: open markets, political alignment, and educational reforms. It was the velvet glove of empire. The Soviet Union not only refused the aid, it forbade its satellite states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, from participating. That one move helped crystallize 2 Europes. That same year, President Harry Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, pledging U.S. support for any country resisting communist influence. It was an elegant phrase for a hard reality. The U.S. would back any regime, movement, or junta that stood against the Soviets. This was not defense. This was an undeclared war. In 1949, NATO was created as a military alliance to contain potential Soviet aggression. The Warsaw Pact, its Eastern Bloc counterpart, emerged in 1955. From that point on, no conflict on Earth could be considered local. If someone fired a rifle in Angola or Korea, the strategy was likely drafted in Washington or Moscow. In 1945, the United States had a nuclear monopoly. By 1949, the Soviet Union had joined the club. The atomic bomb was no longer an American trump card. It was a haunting equalizer. Now, total war meant total extinction. That changed everything. Victory was no longer the goal. Survival was. The years 1945 to 1949 may seem brief, but in that narrow window, the architecture of the Cold War was laid. A divided Europe, ideological confrontation, competing alliances, economic levers, nuclear symmetry, and above all, the world was no longer multipolar. It had become a duel, and in a duel, the worst mistake is to blink first. In the 1950s, America looked like a perfect house with a cracked foundation. On the surface, stability, economic boom, suburbs, television sets, Cadillacs. But inside, fear. Not fear of poverty or war, but fear of an idea. Fear that someone, somewhere, maybe your neighbor, wasn't like the rest. That fear had a name: communism, and it had a face: Senator Joseph McCarthy. It began with a speech. In 1950, speaking in Wheeling, West Virginia, McCarthy claimed he had a list of 205 communists working in the State Department. No one ever saw the list, but it didn't matter. McCarthy had launched a new kind of political offensive, one where accusation replaced evidence. Protecting America became the new populist creed. Senate hearings, newspaper exposés, and televised interrogations fed a growing panic. School teachers, librarians, scientists, soldiers, even war veterans. Anyone could become a suspect, and you didn't need to be guilty, just suspicious. And suspicion could be built on anything: an old club membership, an offhand comment, a book once read, a person once met. Hollywood was the most visible target. Writers, directors, actors, dozens were blacklisted, unable to work, sometimes forced to flee the country or work under fake names. Charlie Chaplin, among others, left the U.S. altogether. This was war without trials. Communists were everywhere, and paradoxically, the more you denied it, the guiltier you looked. Universities demanded loyalty oaths. Employers screened not just resumes, but personal networks. Children reported on teachers. Parents whispered in fear. America was fighting an invisible war against itself. McCarthyism wasn't about law. It was about atmosphere, about the normalizing of fear, about turning suspicion into a form of civic virtue, and most dangerously, about reshaping democracy to justify control. McCarthy wasn't a strategist. He was a performer. His speeches were theatrical, filled with insinuation, heavy with pauses. But in a Cold War climate, performance was enough. The enemy was always just out of sight, and that kept the narrative alive. His downfall came when he went too far, accusing the U.S. Army of communist infiltration. Attacking teachers and actors was one thing. Attacking generals was another. And now there was television. The hearings were broadcast. Millions watched McCarthy in real time and saw not a protector, but a bully. The facade collapsed, but the damage remained. Even after McCarthy's fall, the infrastructure of fear persisted. McCarthyism wasn't just a chapter. It was a distortion of democracy under pressure, a lesson in how quickly a society will trade liberty for the illusion of security. And perhaps the most chilling fact, not one of the thousands accused was ever proven a spy. But thousands lost jobs, careers, reputations, and peace of mind. Picture a continent that had just survived an apocalypse, cities in ruins, fields barren, economies shattered, people surviving on the black market, burning books for warmth, sleeping in cellars. This was Europe in 1947. Now imagine that in the midst of this devastation, a distant power arrives and says, "We'll help, but on our terms." It wasn't Gandhi. It wasn't the United Nations. It was the United States of America. And the offer was simple. Here's billions of dollars. Rebuild your cities. Restart your factories. Feed your children. And become part of our world. Thus was born the Marshall Plan, officially the European Recovery Program. Unofficially, it was the most ambitious economic geopolitical operation in history. Over $13 billion in aid, more than $150 billion in today's money, flowed to 17 countries. Everything from factory equipment to grain, medical supplies, engineers, and yes, movies. But with that aid came American advisors, manuals, standards, and of course, Coca-Cola. Because the Marshall Plan wasn't just about rebuilding economies, it was a soft occupation through lifestyle. Where tanks once rolled, soda machines now hummed. Where bombs once fell, radios now played jazz. The idea was simple. Give Europe a clear alternative to the red model. Show that democracy wasn't just about voting. It was about fridges, paychecks, and candy bars. It worked. Inflation dropped, production soared, people began to dream again, and, crucially, they credited not their own governments, but America. The USSR naturally refused to let its satellite states participate. They saw it for what it was, a Trojan horse. And they weren't wrong, because whatever Washington claimed, the Marshall Plan was still a weapon, just one that didn't smoke. American business arrived with the dollars. Cultural expansion followed, Hollywood, fashion, advertising, management techniques. A new generation grew up believing that America meant modernity. This was the moment when economics became a Cold War front. If the USSR relied on planned industrialization, the U.S. banked on consumption, and consumption became the new sign of a successful society. Europeans drank Coca-Cola and believed that life was getting better. The Marshall Plan wasn't just an economic initiative, it was a political conquest without bullets. Proof that empires could be built not with armies, but with loans. America didn't occupy Europe. It bought it, profitably and with long-term interest. And for decades, Western Europe would remain a cultural and strategic extension of the United States. If the Cold War was a battle for imagination, then Hollywood was its artillery. In the 1940s and 50s, the United States realized that film wasn't just entertainment. It was an instrument of influence. When audiences in Paris, Rome, Caracas, or Bombay saw sleek cars, smiling families, cowboys framed by golden sunsets, or carefree students eating ice cream, they weren't just watching movies. They were witnessing an alternative to their own reality. And that alternative had a name: the American Dream. After World War II, the U.S. didn't just become the center of global cinema because Hollywood had survived. It was because Hollywood had become a strategic asset. Government officials, producers, and screenwriters alike worked, knowingly or not, to make culture as exportable as corn or microchips. That didn't mean every film was propaganda, but nearly every film reinforced a template: personal freedom, self-realization, standing up to injustice, and, almost always, a happy ending. This contrasted sharply with the gray, regulated, didactic reality of the Soviet Union, where films were educational, scripts were vetted by committees, and heroes sacrificed themselves for the collective good. In American films, it was all about individualism, rebellion, and kissing someone while something exploded behind you. The CIA and the State Department were not passive observers. Numerous films were either shaped or directly supported to combat the red threat, sometimes explicitly, more often symbolically. Spy thrillers, dramas about betrayal, comedies with subtle jabs at authoritarianism, all carried the ideological water. Even cartoons, from Disney to Warner Brothers, sometimes snuck in ideological framing. One Bugs Bunny short could do more to define freedom than a dozen political speeches, and it worked. A film like An American in Paris could say more about U.S. influence than any NATO communique. The Soviet Union tried to respond. It churned out anti-capitalist films where Americans were portrayed as greedy, cruel, and soulless. But here was the problem: no one in the West saw them. Meanwhile, American movies played everywhere, including unofficially behind the Iron Curtain. By the 1970s, even Soviet citizens were smuggling in copies of Casablanca or Some Like It Hot. Because those were films you didn't just want to watch. They were films you wanted to live in. Hollywood did more for American soft power than any ambassador, and it continues to do so. Cultural expansion has one key advantage. It feels voluntary. No one forces you to love America. You just love Brad Pitt, and with him, the world he represents. Vietnam, how the U.S. ended up in the jungle without knowing why. This was a war no one officially declared, a war with no clear front lines, a war that didn't start with bullets, but with an idea. We cannot let communism win. The United States slid into the Vietnam War the way one slips into warm water, slowly, without realizing they're about to boil. First came the advisors, then the weapons, then the troops, then tens of thousands of soldiers were flown to fight for a place they couldn't locate on a map a year earlier. To understand the disaster, we have to rewind to colonial history. Until 1954, Vietnam was part of French Indochina. France, no longer quite an empire but still pretending to be one, clung to control. When a rebellion led by Ho Chi Minh erupted, France entered a brutal war and lost. At the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, French forces were decisively defeated, and that's when the United States stepped in. America was already living in the world of dominoes. The theory was simple. If one country falls to communism, others will follow. China had already fallen. Korea was split. If Vietnam goes next, what's to stop Laos? Thailand? Australia? So the U.S. didn't just support South Vietnam. They adopted it. They funded its army, built its infrastructure, trained its spies, and eventually they deployed boots on the ground. There was just one problem. No American politician could clearly define what victory in Vietnam meant. This wasn't a war over territory. It was a war for influence, and influence is a ghost. You can't measure it in miles or medals. Worse still, the regime the U.S. supported in South Vietnam was corrupt, repressive, and barely democratic. But it was anti-communist, and in Cold War logic, that was enough. On the other side was North Vietnam and the Viet Cong guerrillas, ideologically socialist, but in practice, fighting for independence, for land, for national liberation. That made them more than just enemies. It made them relatable to much of the rural population. Meanwhile, the Americans were still foreigners, and so the tragedy began. The U.S. bombed jungles, burned villages, sprayed Agent Orange, and with each strike, they created new guerrillas, faster than they could kill the old ones. This was a war where success was measured in body counts. Numbers became the narrative. 500 enemies killed today? Who were they? How do we know? It didn't matter. Vietnam refused to obey American logic. It wasn't a war of armies. It was a war of ideas, geography, and patience. And with every passing month, America sank deeper into a swamp. It didn't know how to exit. In 1968, America woke up and realized it was losing a war it thought it was winning. It was the year the dominoes fell, but in the opposite direction. not in Laos or Cambodia, but into the universities, the television studios, the American living rooms. The war, once somewhere over there, had arrived at home. It began with the Tet Offensive, a massive coordinated assault by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, launched during the traditional New Year truce. In a single day, more than 100 targets, including the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, were attacked. Militarily, the U.S. repelled the offensive, but in media terms, it was a catastrophe. Television showed Americans an enemy that was not defeated, not desperate, and, most importantly, was everywhere. Up until that point, the Pentagon insisted that victory was near. Tet shattered that illusion in a single week. Then came My Lai, a village in South Vietnam. American soldiers, ordered to root out guerrillas, carried out a massacre. Over 500 civilians, women, children, elderly, were slaughtered. Some were buried alive. Photographs and testimonies emerged that horrified even those who had supported our boys. At first, the Army tried to bury the story, but journalists, whistleblowers, and activists forced it into the light. America now knew the truth and could no longer look away. Meanwhile, a protest movement was erupting. Universities, from Berkeley to Columbia, became battlegrounds. Students burned draft cards, occupied buildings, refused to serve. Music, poetry, film, everything became a weapon. Make love, not war, stopped being a slogan. It became a verdict against the government, against tradition, against war as a way of life. Television became the new front. Nightly news broadcasts brought Vietnam into every kitchen. The wounded, the screams, the napalm, the prisoners, the rising body counts. This was the first televised war, and America saw it not at the movies, but over breakfast. The country split. Some called the protesters traitors. Others called them the last moral voice. And in Washington, leaders no longer knew how to exit without losing face. Every retreat meant victory for Ho Chi Minh. But every day of occupation became moral suicide. Vietnam had stopped being a foreign issue. It had become a domestic firestorm. And with each passing day, more Americans weren't just anti-war. They were anti-America as a warring nation. By the 1960s, the television set had become a symbol of modernity. Now it became a mirror, and America no longer recognized its own reflection. The Vietnam War went down in history as the first major media war. But this media wasn't propaganda. It was unfiltered reality. Reporters had direct access to the front. They filmed without censorship. They showed the wounded, the dead, the chaos, the executions. What had once been hidden in archives or dressed up in patriotic language was now broadcast every night on American television. Imagine this. A family sits down to dinner, turns on the news, and sees an American soldier, bloody, in shock, cradling the lifeless body of a comrade. And it's not a movie. It's CBS. One of the most powerful moments came from Walter Cronkite, the trusted anchor of millions. After the Tet Offensive, he visited Vietnam and reported back, "We are mired in stalemate, and it seems more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. He wasn't a politician, not an activist, just the voice of regular America. And when even he began to doubt, something broke. Public trust in the government began to collapse. Young people stopped believing in heroism. The older generation stopped believing in promises. Republicans and Democrats both stopped believing in their leaders. For the first time in decades, mass cynicism became a cultural norm. No one believed anything at face value. Every "for freedom" was heard as just another op. Every "for stability" sounded like cover for strategic interests. It was a moment when the government lost its monopoly on the truth. Journalists became the new heroes. Cameras became the new weapons. And society itself became the battlefield. Meanwhile, the administration tried to contain the situation. Briefings, controlled messaging, official statistics. But the truth leaked everywhere, into newspapers, into protests, into song lyrics. The irony is stark. The United States possessed the greatest military machine on earth and lost a war because of mistrust, not because it couldn't kill more, but because it no longer knew why it was killing. It wasn't a defeat of the Army. It was a defeat of the narrative. When reality surpasses rhetoric, no language is left that sounds convincing. If America built its empire with Coca-Cola and Hollywood, the Soviet Union built its own with tanks and treaties. The idea was simple. We are a fortress surrounded by enemies, but we alone hold the key to the future. After World War II, the USSR emerged from devastation, with catastrophic losses but immense influence. Eastern Europe came under its control. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. Ideologically, they were class brothers. In practice, they were occupied territories ruled from Moscow. Any attempt to stray from orbit was crushed. Budapest in 1956. Prague in 1968. Tanks didn't persuade, but they intimidated. After empires, how Korea became a broken chessboard. In August 1945, Korea celebrated freedom for the first time in 35 years. Imperial Japan, which had brutally occupied the peninsula since 1910, surrendered after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But joy quickly gave way to uncertainty. Korea, rich in resources, strategically placed, and ideologically unformed, became the object of a new geopolitical division. With little consultation of the Korean people themselves, the two victorious powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, divided the country along the 38th parallel. In the north, the Soviet occupation zone. In the south, the American. Both sides promised it was temporary, but each began building its own provisional administration. In North Korea, power was handed to Kim Il-sung, a young, charismatic Soviet-trained officer. In the South, Syngman Rhee, staunchly anti-communist and backed by the U.S., rose to leadership. Both men dreamed of unifying Korea, but under their own banners. In 1948, what the UN had feared came to pass. Two separate states were created. North Korea with a communist regime under Soviet and later Chinese patronage. South Korea, backed by the U.S. and aligned with the West. Diplomacy had failed, and the peninsula became an ideological front line. On the morning of June 25, 1950, war began not with declarations, but with tanks. North Korea launched a sudden invasion across the 38th parallel. No formal warning, no diplomatic preamble. It was a lightning strike. Soviet T-34s, artillery, infantry, moving like a Second World War script. Within days, Seoul had fallen. Kim Il-sung was convinced that his Soviet-trained army would unify Korea within weeks. In Washington, alarm bells rang. The United States had barely recovered from the trauma of World War II, but now faced a new front. President Harry Truman acted quickly. "This is a test for the United Nations," he said. "If we allow one country to invade another without consequences, the world becomes a jungle." For the first time in history, the UN Security Council authorized military action against an aggressor. American forces, joined by troops from 15 other nations, landed in South Korea. Leading them was General Douglas MacArthur, a living legend from the Pacific Theater. But early battles went poorly. South Korean forces crumbled. Casualties mounted. By August, all that remained was the small Pusan perimeter, a final bastion in the south. It seemed that North Korea was on the brink of total victory. But the United States was preparing a bold response. And it was already en route. In September 1950, General MacArthur made one of the boldest military moves of the 20th century, a naval landing at Incheon, deep behind North Korean lines. The maneuver seemed reckless. Narrow tides, rocky shoals, uncertain weather, but it worked. Within days, the Allies had retaken Seoul, and the North Korean army was in disarray. The war reversed course. Now, U.S. and South Korean forces pushed north. By November 1950, UN troops reached the Yalu River, the border with China. In Washington, talk of victory grew louder. MacArthur envisioned a unified Korea, but he had underestimated Beijing. China, fresh from its own civil war, did not want an American army at its doorstep. In late November, over 300,000 volunteers from the People's Liberation Army crossed the Yalu. They lacked high-tech weapons, but brought numbers, resolve, and cold endurance. Mass assaults, night raids, human wave tactics. It shocked American forces. The UN advance collapsed. Seoul fell for a second time. The winter of 1950-1951 became a symbol of brutal mountainous hell, minus 30 degrees, snow, frostbite, retreat under constant fire. MacArthur demanded permission to hit China, even suggesting nuclear weapons. But Truman, fearing World War III, dismissed him. New leadership sought not escalation, but positional stability. By 1951, the front had stabilized near the 38th parallel. Casualties on both sides mounted, but no decisive outcome emerged. Battles were fought over every hill, every ridge, with little strategic gain. Negotiations began. They would last 2 full years. On July 27, 1953, the parties signed an armistice in Panmunjom. Not a peace treaty, not a surrender, just an agreement to stop shooting. The front line became a demarcation line, and the space between North and South, the DMZ, one of the most heavily fortified borders on Earth. North Korea remained under the rule of the Kim dynasty. starting with Kim Il-sung, followed by his son and grandson. A regime defined by isolation, cult of personality, and nuclear ambition. South Korea, meanwhile, moved from dictatorship to democracy, becoming one of the most advanced economies in the world. But the war has never officially ended. Diplomatically, North and South Korea remain in a state of war. Tensions flare periodically, provocations, shellings, missile tests. In the 21st century, the threat once again has a nuclear edge. The Korean War is not a forgotten conflict. It's an open scar of the Cold War, still shaping global politics. A story with no victors, only those who manage to survive. Every war has an end, but not every war brings peace. The Korean War never truly ended. It merely shifted into standby mode. Along the front, concrete, barbed wire, surveillance cameras. In rhetoric, total destruction, preemptive strike, irreversible response. These aren't metaphors, they're real scenarios locked inside command bunkers. In the 2020s, the situation increasingly echoes the 1950s. North Korea parades missiles, tests hypersonic weapons, demands recognition as a nuclear power. In response, the U.S. and South Korea conduct massive drills, deploy aircraft carriers, install advanced missile defenses. China watches quietly but carefully. This is no longer just about Korea. It's about global fragility, about a world where old frameworks of deterrence are cracking, where a 70-year-old frozen conflict may become the spark for something far hotter. Not a proxy war, but a direct one. Korea's story is a warning, not of the past, but of the present. Because when a war has no official end, it can always begin again, especially when the world starts to believe it's been forgotten. Zapatata ChatGPT. The Soviet Union was totalitarian but not primitive. It modernized, launched Sputnik, sent Gagarin to space, developed heavy industry, science, and universal education. And it sustained total control, censorship, the KGB, ideological uniformity. Propaganda never stopped. The enemy was the West, America, the empire of lies, the Cold War, a cosmic struggle for humanity's soul. A Soviet student might know how many teeth a shark has, but would also be certain that in the U.S., homeless people slept under bridges. Meanwhile, inside the USSR, shortages, long queues, poverty, but also pride. Millions sincerely believed they were building a more just society. That over there was hypocrisy and racism, while here was equality and brotherhood. The truth was more complex, but looking for it was dangerous. The USSR invested in everything: nuclear weapons, friendly regimes in Africa, Asia, Latin America. Cuba, Angola, Afghanistan all became ideological battlegrounds, even if the USSR claimed not to be at war. The cost was massive. Less and less money went to daily life, more and more to the military. Year by year, the Cold War looked like a treadmill sprint with weights strapped on. The Soviet Union wasn't losing, but it wasn't winning either. It held the line, firmly, consistently, with conviction, but without flexibility. And with each crisis, Cuba, Afghanistan, the arms race, resources thinned, and the world moved on. In December 1979, Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan. The official statement spoke of supporting a legitimate government and protecting the people from extremists. In reality, it was a calculated imperial move, an attempt to preserve Soviet influence, to prevent the spread of radical Islam, and to uphold a global ideological chessboard. It would become one of the longest, costliest wars for the USSR since World War II. The roots of the intervention lay in the 1978 Sour Revolution, when Afghanistan's monarchy was overthrown and a socialist regime installed under Nur Muhammad Taraki, later replaced by Hafizullah Amin. Amin quickly became a problem, erratic, unreliable, and increasingly viewed by the KGB as a threat. In December, Soviet special forces assassinated him. In his place, Moscow installed Babrak Karmal, loyal but weak. The idea was simple: stabilize a friendly socialist state. The reality would be much more complex. Soviet troops entered a land they didn't understand. They brought tanks to a terrain of mountains. They brought ideology to a culture steeped in tribal autonomy and Islamic tradition. And they brought young men, many just 18 or 19, who didn't know why they were there. One of them was Senior Lieutenant Alexander Anatolievich Denisenko, a reconnaissance officer. In 1980, within months of his deployment, he was wounded in a skirmish outside Kabul. After recovering, he requested to return. There is discipline to impose, but these people don't respond to orders, he reportedly wrote. He died a year later in an ambush, trying to evacuate injured comrades. His best friend Sergei buried him under fire. On the other side was Mohammad Nadir, a school teacher before the war. After his wife was killed during a bombing raid in Kabul, he joined a local Mujahideen cell. He led a small group operating in the Badakhshan Mountains. "We weren't fanatics," he later told a Red Crescent doctor. "We fought for land, for honor, for the right not to be ruled by outsiders." In 1982, his group ambushed a Soviet T-55 tank, disabling it. Nadir survived, but lost 3 of his men. The Soviets applied traditional doctrine: secure cities, control infrastructure, suppress insurgents. But Afghanistan defied the script. Outside the cities, in the mountains and valleys, the Mujahideen waged a relentless guerrilla war. They struck at night, vanished by dawn. They laid mines on roads, sniped from ridges, and melted into the population. Meanwhile, the Soviet narrative remained rigid. The intervention was branded an international duty, a defense of socialism. But privately, doubts grew. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev admitted, "We have lost 14.2 billion rubles just on operational costs." The war was eating the USSR alive, not just financially, but spiritually. Back home, the human toll mounted. Officially, 15,000 Soviet soldiers died. Unofficially, estimates range up to 25,000. Tens of thousands more were wounded, many mutilated. Among Afghan civilians, the numbers were staggering: over 1 million dead, 5 million refugees, entire villages wiped off the map. Kabul, ostensibly under Soviet control, was a war zone. Hospitals overflowed. Humanitarian workers described horrors. Nobel Peace Prize nominee Shirzad Moradi, working with the UN, wrote, "I treated boys with missing limbs who smiled through their pain. The doctors closed wounds. The images stayed bitter." In Moscow, the war became harder to explain. First praised in state media, it slowly faded into euphemism. By the mid-1980s, the mood shifted. Parents began asking why their sons weren't coming home. Widows, like Natalia Salyuk, began corresponding with foreign journalists. Her husband, an artillery captain, died in a mission that was never publicly acknowledged. She received a letter with vague condolences and a closed casket. The rift between propaganda and reality widened. Soldiers returned and whispered the truth. Veterans formed informal support groups. Some turned to alcohol, others to silence. The official story no longer matched the lived experience. Yet the Soviet military persisted. Cities were fortified. Airstrikes continued. Villages were burned under suspicion of harboring insurgents. The logic was simple: control through force. But force bred resistance. Every bomb created more rebels. At home, society grew numb. News programs still showed support for our boys in Kabul, but citizens turned away. They had other concerns: food shortages, rising prices, long lines. Why Afghanistan? People began to ask. The war felt distant, meaningless, imposed from above, and in 1989, it ended. The Geneva Accords were signed. The last Soviet tank crossed the Friendship Bridge. Officially, the USSR had fulfilled its duty. Unofficially, it had retreated from a war it couldn't win, in a country it never truly understood. The regime it left behind collapsed within years. Civil war resumed. By 1996, the Taliban seized control of Kabul. The very threat the Soviets had tried to contain had taken power. The Soviet-Afghan War was not just a military failure, it was a moral one. An empire had reached too far and cracked. The soldiers came home without parades. The war became a whisper, a scar, a slow undoing. At what point does war stop being about territory and start being about imagination? When does it stop being about who outmaneuvers whom on the battlefield and become about who has more missiles, satellites, and kilograms of plutonium? The Cold War of the 1980s was the culmination of an armed worldview, a conflict where neither side wanted war, yet both believed it was inevitable. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan launched a new phase of the arms race. We must not only be stronger, we must be so strong that no one dares challenge us. Thus was born the ambitious, almost cinematic plan known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, or, as it became known, Star Wars. The idea was fantastical: a space-based system of lasers and satellites that could intercept Soviet ballistic missiles mid-flight. On paper, science fiction. In practice, an expensive myth. But the myth worked. Moscow didn't know what was real and what was theatrical smoke. The Soviet Union responded as best it could. Development of R-36 Satan intercontinental missiles, mobile Topol launchers, and the modernization of its submarine fleet, including the infamous Typhoon-class nuclear subs, each capable of carrying 20 nuclear missiles. A single sub could erase multiple countries, and they could remain invisible for months. Both sides escalated the psychological game. In 1983, the U.S. conducted the Able Archer military exercise, which looked to Soviet intelligence like a genuine nuclear strike preparation. The Soviet Union panicked. Intelligence Operation Ryan logged extraordinary activity. Some analysts believe the world was then within 48 hours of nuclear war. In orbit, another arms race unfolded. The USSR launched its Salyut and Mir stations. The U.S. expanded its network of spy satellites, cameras with resolution sharp enough to read newspaper headlines from space. A 1984 Pentagon report declared, "Space will be the next battlefield. Whoever controls orbit controls Earth." This filtered into popular culture. Films like War Games and Red Dawn normalized the fear of automated war. Children practiced nuclear drills in school. Textbooks instructed how to hide under desks in the event of a blast, as if plywood could shield against megatons. By the mid-1980s, the race had reached its peak. The U.S. was spending up to 6.5% of its GDP on defense, over $300 billion. The Soviet Union was spending even more, hidden through budget gaps and shortages. The nation lacked soap, but was building new nuclear test sites in Semipalatinsk. This was a time when the logic of fear became the logic of governance. No one wanted war, but both prepared as if it was inevitable. In the end, both systems found themselves trapped. The only victory was not pressing the button. If wars begin with guns and slogans, they often end in silence and shortages. The Cold War had no final battle, no treaty signed to trumpet fanfare. Its end came in tired steps backward from both sides. In 1985, the Kremlin saw the rise of a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, younger, more flexible, with ideas of perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness. "We must not only be a great country," he said, "we must become a normal one." But the Soviet Union was already in crisis. The Afghan war, a collapsing economy, empty store shelves, and, most of all, a deep fatigue spreading through society. Meanwhile, in the U.S., the tone shifted too. President Ronald Reagan, architect of the Star Wars defense system, began changing his rhetoric. No longer the evil empire. Now it was about partnership, diplomacy, shared responsibility. In 1987, he joked with tourists in Red Square. This was no longer Cold War. It was a thaw. Détente arrived, a wave of negotiations and treaties, arms control, bans on nuclear testing, troop withdrawals. The INF Treaty, one of the most significant in nuclear history, was signed. Missiles were dismantled, though paranoia lingered. Across Eastern Europe, new sounds were heard. Independent newspapers, student protests, the rise of new parties. In Poland, solidarity. In Czechoslovakia, the Velvet Revolution. In East Germany, a military no longer willing to fire on its own people. Then came 1989. The Berlin Wall fell. Stones that once symbolized global division now became souvenirs. People crossed the border not as spies, but as tourists. Soldiers stood aside. No one gave the order. It wasn't a surrender. It was emotional exhaustion. The illusions no longer held. Propaganda collapsed under the weight of television screens. Communism didn't fall in battle. It fell from within, from a lack of belief in its own future. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. No explosions, no marches, just dissolution, a structure that could no longer be held up by fear or faith. The Cold War was over, but not erased. It left behind a paranoid worldview, a culture of mistrust, and a generation that had lived under the shadow of a single red button. The world had changed, and yet felt just as anxious. Because the Cold War had moved on from geopolitics and entered the mind. We like to think the Cold War ended, that the Iron Curtain fell and the missiles went silent. But history, as always, is less interested in happy endings than we are. Today, the world once again speaks in the language of blocks. Borders bristle. Satellites track everything. The arms are smaller, faster, smarter, but the distrust is familiar. Russia, China, NATO, new rivalries, old patterns. We live in an age where information is weaponized, alliances tested, and words like strategic deterrence quietly return to daily briefings. The Cold War taught the world how to survive without fighting, but also how to fear without pause. Perhaps its greatest legacy is not the arsenal it left behind, but the mindset, a world trained to see threat first and understanding second. And so, as we scroll and stream and swipe through headlines of tension, it's worth asking, are we still living in a Cold War, only colder, quieter, and better dressed? Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most defining conflicts of modern history. If you enjoyed this deep dive, subscribe to our channel for more slow-burning, fact-rich historical stories. And let us know in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? We'd love to know how far these stories travel. Until next time, stay curious.